Imagine the entire internet. Every article, every research paper, every book ever digitized, every map, every medical study, every scientific formula. Now imagine someone sets it on fire. Not all at once, slowly, page by page, scroll by scroll, over hundreds of years, until there is nothing left. That is roughly what happened to the Library of Alexandria, and most people have no idea how bad the loss actually was. Here is the thing that blows my mind every single time I think about it. Scholars in ancient Alexandria had already calculated the circumference of the Earth to within 1% accuracy in 240 BC, over 2,000 years before we sent a satellite into orbit. They had working steam-powered devices. They had advanced surgical tools. They had astronomical models that tracked the movement of planets with shocking precision. And almost all of it is gone. Not because of one fire, not because of one stupid accident, but because of a long, deliberate, embarrassing series of decisions made by powerful people who were threatened by knowledge they could not control. So let's talk about what this place actually was, what was inside it, who destroyed it, and why the world is still paying for that loss right now. The Library of Alexandria was not just some ancient bookshelf. Think bigger, way bigger. It was the most ambitious intellectual project in the history of the ancient world. Built around 285 BC under Ptolemy I, one of Alexander, the great generals who took control of Egypt after Alexander died. Ptolemy had this wild vision of collecting every piece of written knowledge that existed anywhere on Earth and putting it in one place, and he was not playing around about it. He issued a decree that any ship entering the port of Alexandria had to surrender its scrolls for copying, not buying, not borrowing, surrender. The Egyptians would copy the scrolls, keep the originals, and hand back the copies. So right from the start, this place was built on a kind of intellectual aggression that is honestly kind of impressive. The library grew to hold somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, depending on the source. That is an absolutely staggering number for a world where every single one of those scrolls had to be written by hand. And it was not just storage. The Library of Alexandria was part of a larger complex called the Mauseon, which translates to something close to the House of the Muses. Think of it as the world's first research university. Scholars were given free housing, free food, a salary from the state. Their only job was to think, research, and write. The Ptolemaic kings were essentially funding the world's greatest think tank. And for a while, it worked better than anyone could have possibly imagined. But here is where the cliffhanger kicks in. The library's greatest era of brilliance also planted the seeds of its destruction, because when you concentrate that much power and that much knowledge in one place, eventually, someone is going to come for it. Let's talk about what was actually inside, because this is the part that should genuinely disturb you. One of the library's most famous scholars was a man named Eratosthenes, chief librarian around 245 BC. This guy figured out the circumference of the Earth using nothing but a stick, shadows, and geometry. He got it right to within about 200 miles in a world with no satellites, no GPS, no aircraft, just pure mathematics. That work, and most of the detailed follow-up research it inspired, is gone. Then there was Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, meaning he argued the Earth orbited the Sun, not the other way around. He did this around 270 BC. That is nearly 1,800 years before Copernicus proposed the same idea in 1543, and was nearly condemned as a heretic for it. Aristarchus's original detailed work? Mostly lost. We only know he made the argument. because other scholars quoted him briefly in texts that managed to survive. Hero of Alexandria built a working steam-powered device called an eolipile around 50 AD, a rotating sphere driven entirely by steam. The knowledge that could have extended from that invention, the engineering principles, the applied physics, the industrial potential, all of it, sat in a library that was in the process of being dismantled, and the West would not rediscover steam power as an industrial tool until the 1700s. That is a gap of roughly 1,650 years. Let that sink in. The library also held Euclid's complete works on geometry, most of which survived. But scholars believe there were dozens of additional mathematical treatises in that library that have never been recovered. Works on optics, mechanics, and music theory that were referenced by other authors, but have never been found. We are reading footnotes about books that no longer exist. And here is what should really keep you up at night. We do not even know everything that was in there, because the catalog itself was lost too. Now let's clear up the biggest myth in this whole story, because Hollywood got this completely wrong, and it has been driving historians insane for centuries. The popular version goes like this. Julius Caesar shows up in 48 BC. His fleet catches fire. The fire spreads to the docks. The Library of Alexandria burns down. End of story. Done. Tragic accident. Move on. That is not what happened. Yes, Caesar was in Alexandria during a civil war. Yes, there is some evidence that a fire broke out near the harbor. But ancient sources, including Plutarch and Cassius Dio, suggest that what burned was either a warehouse of scrolls near the docks, waiting to be shipped, or a smaller collection, stored outside the main library complex. The main library appears to have survived Caesar's visit almost entirely intact. So why does everyone blame Caesar? Partly because the story is clean. It has a villain, a fire, the clear moment of loss. People love that narrative, but history is almost never that clean. The real story is messier, slower, and honestly, much more damning. The truth is, the Library of Alexandria did not burn once. It declined across several centuries through a combination of underfunding, political indifference, deliberate suppression, and targeted violence. And the people responsible were not Roman generals stumbling around with torches. They were emperors, bishops, and mobs acting on orders. Here is where it gets dark. And I mean genuinely dark. In 391 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued an edict effectively banning paganism throughout the Roman Empire. Christianity had become the state religion decades earlier, under Constantine, and Theodosius was done tolerating what he considered heretical institutions. Shortly after this edict, a Christian mob in Alexandria, reportedly led by, or at least acting under the approval of the bishop, Theophilus, attacked and destroyed the Serapeum, a temple complex in Alexandria that housed the significant secondary collection of the library scrolls. Thousands of scrolls burned in that attack. Not a war, not an accident, a mob acting on religious authority. And then, in 415 AD, one of the most horrifying events in the history of human thought took place. A woman named Hypatia, a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, who was at the time one of the greatest minds in the world, was dragged from her carriage by a Christian mob in Alexandria. They murdered her in the street. They are reported to have used roof tiles to flay her skin. She was killed because she was a pagan intellectual, and because she was politically inconvenient to the bishop Cyril, who scholars widely believe incited or at least tolerated the attack. Hypatia was also one of the last great scholars directly associated with the Alexandrian intellectual tradition. Her death is often cited as a symbolic endpoint for that era of ancient learning. After her murder, many scholars fled Alexandria entirely. The community of thought, that had sustained the library for centuries simply dissolved. And just to make it even more grim, when the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria in 641 AD, he allegedly asked Caliph Umar what to do with whatever remained of the library's collections. The reported response, which historians still debate in terms of its accuracy, was essentially, if the books agree with the Quran, they are redundant. If they disagree, they are heretical. Burn them either way. Whether or not that exchange is perfectly accurate, the effect was the same. What little remained vanished. 7 centuries of decline, suppression, and fire. Not one night of tragedy. A long, slow, deliberate erasure. So here's the question that actually matters. What did we lose? Not in terms of individual text, but in terms of where humanity might actually be right now, if those scrolls had survived. Historians and scientists have spent a lot of time on this, and the honest answer is uncomfortable. The ancient Greeks and Alexandrian scholars had already made breakthroughs in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and medicine that were simply not rediscovered in the Western world until the Renaissance or later. Aristarchus placed the sun at the center of the solar system, 1,800 years before Copernicus. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference accurately, 2,000 years before modern instruments confirmed it. Hero of Alexandria built functional, steam-powered devices 1,600 years before the Industrial Revolution. Carl Sagan famously argued in his series Cosmos that if the Library of Alexandria had survived, and the tradition of learning it represented had continued without interruption, humanity might have landed on the moon by around 500 AD. That is not science fiction. That is a serious extrapolation of the rate of scientific progress that was already happening in Alexandria before the library's decline began. 1,000 years of potential progress simply wiped away. And the kicker? We will never know for certain what was lost, because the catalog is gone too. We are aware that works by Aristotle, Euclid, and others existed in far more complete form than what survived. We know that medical texts from ancient Alexandria described procedures and anatomical knowledge that physicians in the medieval period had to completely reinvent from scratch. We are working from fragments, footnotes, and secondhand references to a body of knowledge that may have been the most comprehensive ever assembled in the ancient world. What we have left is like finding the index to a library after the library itself burned down. You can read the titles. You can imagine what was there, but the books are gone. There is one final thing worth knowing about this story, because it is the part that most documentaries skip entirely. The Library of Alexandria was not just a tragedy of the past. It is a warning for right now. Knowledge is not permanent. It is not self-sustaining. It requires active protection, active funding, and active political will. The library did not fall because it was unlucky. It fell because the people in power stopped caring about preserving it, and then eventually started actively working against it. Sound familiar? Right now, digitized archives go offline. Academic papers get locked behind paywalls that most of the world cannot afford. Historical records get purged when institutions collapse or governments change. Languages go extinct at a rate of roughly 1 every 2 weeks, taking with them entire oral traditions, medical knowledge about local plants, navigation techniques, and cultural histories that exist nowhere else on Earth. The Library of Alexandria is not ancient history. It is a pattern, and the only thing that has ever stopped. That pattern is a generation of people who decided that the preservation of knowledge was worth fighting for. So the next time someone tells you that history does not matter, or that old knowledge is irrelevant, remember what was on those shelves. Remember what we lost, and remember that losing it was not inevitable. It was a choice. Choices made by powerful people who decided that control mattered more than curiosity. And we have been paying for those choices ever since. If you want more stories about the moments in history that changed everything, and nobody talks about, hit subscribe.